Should Christians celebrate Halloween? That is what we're talking about today. I've got a Christian author who's been on the channel before talking about miracles. Completely different subject tonight. We're talking about Halloween. Does it have pagan origins? Is it okay for Christians to celebrate Halloween? And then all the sort of related things about horror and how should Christians sort of think about this? But you've got a presentation for us, Caleb, and I'm excited to get into it. Instead of do like these long out introductions, I try to get into the meat as quickly as possible. So if you'd like to learn more about my guest, check the description of this video. But let's go ahead and jump in. Let's do it. I'm excited to see your presentation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on again. It's a pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm a Christian author, currently doing a very large book on miracles, which has nothing to do with this subject, but I also happen to be a very big fan of movies, particularly horror movies. And so the thought about how those can be integrated or if there is incompatibility with that and being, Christian apologist to Christian has been something I thought of for the past few years. So yeah, this was kind of a thing we arranged last minute, nothing too formal, but some thoughts that I had. And so to give a little bit of background on the presentation before we go, there was in looking up
real quick before you talk about the presentation, did you watch the right now? Okay, so for those of you watching live, you know what day it is and everything, but if you're watching this in the future, which is going to apply to the vast majority of people that are watching this video, today is October 27th, 2023. All right, and what just came out in the movies is the new Exorcist movie, Exorcist Believer. Did you watch that?
I did not watch it. I'm planning on it, but I heard it was really bad. So I have not been overly optimistic for it. I did see the new Saw movie though, which is significantly different than that. But that was pretty good. But yeah, I have not seen it yet. I do plan on seeing it. But it's a sort of a requel, which is where it's a sequel, but they have legacy characters in it and so forth. But from the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, in other words, it didn't look like it was very good. But I'll have to judge for myself. Are you planning on doing an interview with an exorcist on that? I know that got pushed back, but
yeah, I haven't followed up with him yet, just because he was, it was a sort of health issue that came up. So I'm trying to give him some time and space, but I will reach back out and try to set something up. But I was going to talk to you about that movie. I haven't seen Saw, but yeah, that Exorcist Believer was. I was extremely bored. Like I was checking my phone. I was not locked in, but I watched it for this interview so that we could. I had to watch it.
I'm disappointed. Yeah, I've seen the original Exorcist though, but I'm sorry that I hadn't prepared that much for this. But no, definitely.
One other thing that you brought up where you were like, because you talked about miracles, you've been on the show about miracles, and you're like, there's no connection between miracles and Halloween and stuff. I think it's maybe like I can't think of the right term. There is a sort of connection between the two. Okay, and here's what I'm thinking. So all wrapped up in Halloween, we just talked about it, like demons, demonic, supernatural, that whole realm. Those questions start to get raised when you're thinking about Halloween. And there's all sorts of people. I've had them on my channel, exorcists and everything. I've had people on my channel that have said, look, demon possession is a real thing. Like I've seen it. It's, it's real. Super interesting topic. But I think that, and you're definitely going to want to speak to this. So I think that there's a lot of overlap between like the case that can be made for the supernatural realm, and especially specifically with respect to demons and miracles, like a miracle claim, someone testifying to the fact that they were healed at this certain time right when this person prayed, and then their the cancer went away, or they completely got healed and were able to walk when they weren't able to walk before, and all that sort of stuff. And so I think that testimony is sort of playing a role there. Maybe that's the connection between the two, but obviously testimony can apply way outside these two realms. But I think that there is a sort of there's something to be said that they share.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Before we get to your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point in terms of the supernatural being connected. I have expressed in the past that I don't talk about possession very much in the book that I'm doing. And that's because I'm a bit more cynical on that. And part of that's just because I think the criteria are a little bit more loose than they would be for a healing. And it's a lot harder, I think, to verify some of these things and to rule out things. So I'm very much more hesitant about that. But I will say, recently I have been reading a book that's over in the bookshelf by Carlos Ayer, who's a Yale historian. Actually, you probably should have him on your show sometime. Just came out, called "They Flew: A History of the Impossible," and he gives, and the book's about a couple of medieval saints who could allegedly levitate. And this is not just, an account that was written 100 years later. These are people, affidavits, hundreds of witnesses saying, I saw this person float. And I don't mean like float like a few inches, I mean float 20, 30 feet in the air, suspended, head in the, for like 10, 30 minutes at a time. And there are also accounts in that book he talks about of demoniacs, so people who allegedly were possessed. And we have eyewitness accounts from church fathers talking about how there would be women who'd be lifted up in the air several feet and just be hanging there upside down, suspended in the air. So I do think that is an interesting connection between some of this stuff, as you say. Haven't finished the book yet, but I probably will have a chapter on stuff like that in the second volume of the book. But yeah, that's a little tangential note on
yeah,
that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get too far off track here. But yeah, let's get to the presentation. I'm excited to see what you've got planned for us.
Absolutely. Tonight. So okay, got it brought up there. So I aptly named it Halloween or Hallelujah. I got like a little bit.
I thought that was clever. I was like, when you sent that over, I was like, okay, this is those.
And I have the subtitle, A Cruciform Hermeneutic of Horror in Christianity. So we'll get into what exactly that means real fast. Okay, does that move? I switched the slides there, but that's fine. So typically, a lot of Christians, I'll actually go to the next slide real fast. Yeah, there we go. I'll go back to that. So a lot of Christians, there wasn't that much data in terms of how Christians feel about Halloween, at least contemporaneously. But there was one study done by Lifeway of about 1,000 people. This was back in 2015, so not too long ago, about Christian views of Halloween and stuff like that. And so, as you can say, majority of them would say, or this is about among Americans, I should say specifically. So 60% of Americans in general are okay with it. The number for Christians specifically, I believe, was about 54% or so. And the numbers are about equal in terms of people who celebrate it for fun, people who celebrate it, but they have a replacement like a fall festival or like a trunk or treat where, we can do Halloween, we can do trick or treating, but you're going to dress up as like a Marvel character. You're not going to dress up as Jason Voorhees or something like that. And then you have about a quarter of Christians who don't celebrate it at all because it's demonically associated in the way that they perceive that. So I thought that was interesting. And what kind of inspired me to do this was I do, as I say, enjoy movies, especially horror movies. And I've done movie reviews before, and I'll post it. I was doing a review earlier this year on Scream 6. And I just had someone comment like, oh, why are you reviewing these movies? And you're like a Christian apologist. Isn't that like, kind of incompatible? Isn't, you're glorifying violence or whatever. So I do think it's interesting, but a lot of these objections that you will hear from people are the idea that, well, look, Halloween, and some people say Christmas as well, is a holiday that has pagan origins, traditionally comes from the idea of a Celtic holiday called Samhain, or it's spelled Samhain, but pronounced Samhain, which is the idea that the Celts around October 31st would celebrate the dead coming back, and that's when the realm between the dead and the living was the weakest. And so ghosts would come and they would dress up as ghosts to disguise themselves so the ghosts wouldn't harm them, and they would leave out treats for these ghosts to like offerings, basically. Now, there's a lot of historical debate in terms of whether that was actually on October 31st, and so that's sort of contested, and people like Michael Jones have done a good job citing stuff like that. But other people will point to saying that, well, no, look, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, can be traced back to Catholicism in the 4th, 5th, 6th century or so. And some people say that the Catholics Christianized this pagan holiday. It's not entirely clear which one came first, but the Catholics would have All Saints Day, All Hallows Eve before then, where they would have people dress up as saints with their little lanterns. Now, they didn't use pumpkins then, it was turnips, because pumpkins, I think, weren't discovered until the New World. So they used turnips to light the way, and they would go door to door and ask for soul cakes, like these little baked cookies almost. And in exchange for that, they would offer prayers for the souls in purgatory. So you would come there, you would give them that, and they would travel around giving prayers in exchange for treats. And so some people say, well, that's the origins of this holiday. But other people say, well, look, Halloween has occultic and demonic associations. People play with Ouija boards and have some extreme people may do hard drugs or even animal sacrifice and sort of like, and it's endorsement of hedonism. People get drunk, people wear rather promiscuous outfits, as shall we say, and it's an endorsement of hedonism and ideas that are not compatible with Christian ethics. So I think all of those points are valid and should be considered, but I don't think we have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So On the issue of origins, I don't spend much time on it. I don't think it's overly relevant because even if I were to grant, for the sake of argument, even though historically it's in dispute, that there were pagan origins with it or pagan affiliations, I don't see why that in a Christian perspective would matter, because Christianity is centered on the idea, it's the very basis that we take things that are broken, that are initially evil, and we turn them into good things. We take things and we make them born again. We have redemption. We have Christianization of these things. And so I can think of nothing more Christian conceptually than taking evil and making it into something good, taking something that's about demons and ghosts and the occult and making it about the saints and about living a virtuous life and praying for people. I think that would be the most Christian thing I could perhaps think of as a holiday. So origin shouldn't matter in that context. These other 2 points are important. We'll get to them, but I do think we should look at the flip side. Not only, should we consider ideas about should we celebrate Halloween or is it okay to, but I think there are even arguments about endorsement in terms of here's positive reasons why it actually might be beneficial to celebrate Halloween, right? So to play devil's advocate, which was intentionally the pun there, get it? Halloween, which actually is a Christian concept, by the way, the devil's advocate. That I think that there are three main.
You went way too quick on that joke.
I did. I should have let that sit.
You should have.
You didn't laugh. It would have been.
You're
really
like talking too fast.
I try not to, but it would have been really uncomfortable had you not laughed. So.
Oh gosh.
So I think there are three main points I would say that a Christian could use in terms of endorsement of Halloween. So one is that Halloween as an ideology really supports the idea of the triumph of Christianity over death and evil. Next one is horror as a genre exhibits many key Judeo-Christian principles and morals, which may seem counterintuitive, but we'll get into that. And third, just as a point of reference, is that Christians are to mock evil, but I think there are limitations. And so there are limits that this is not just a permission to do anything and everything on Halloween, but certainly I think there's enough there we can do. And so I'm not saying that we should just, have fall festivals and counter events, Christianize events to counter Halloween around October, but that, no, it's actually okay to participate in haunted houses, to dress up as monster clowns or whatever, right? In that sense, if you so be it, watch horror movies, etc., within certain limits. And I think there's quite a few Christian concepts. And so that's what we're going to be looking at with this. So going back to the subtitle, I think that there's actually quite a lot we can look at Halloween through the lens of the cross, right? So what do we mean by that? Well, there's this idea of cruciformity. It's a term that I got from Greg Boyd. I don't know if he invented it, but I don't know how familiar you are with Greg Boyd stuff, Cameron, about Old Testament violence and looking through the Old Testament through the lens of the cross. But he uses this idea of a cruciform hermeneutic, that Christ is the most prominent and most clear revelation of God. He was God incarnate. And that is how we should look through the rest of the Bible. So if there's problematic passages or passages that seem in conflict with the notion of Christ, the nature of Christ, that's how we look through it, through the lens of Christ.
Yeah, so the term that I am familiar with is Christocentric, not cruciform. What are the differences?
Christocentric. I don't think there is a difference. I think it's just a synonymous word, but Christocentric is good too. But yeah, cruciform being a reference to like the act of crucifixion specifically. So one could take the arguments against Halloween and on the face of it could look at it from an outsider's perspective of Christianity to say, well, look, if you were to just see without knowing the context, an image of a bloodied Christ covered in blood, gore, thorns, stripped naked. Of course, usually he's given a garment out of modesty, but realistically probably wouldn't have any clothes on, displayed publicly in forms of execution. You would probably be horrified and disgusted and say, well, this is just violence. This is glorification of gore and sexuality, and this is not appropriate for people to be seeing, right? And yet, of course, we don't react that way. In fact, Christians often wear, as I'm, crucifixes, or at least crosses, which is literally a symbol of execution. And typically people will have, the dead man literally hanging on it. And of course, we don't say this is an endorsement of violence or gore or anything like that. We say that, no, beneath this initially really ugly portrait that we see, there's a much deeper message of beauty, of salvation. And it's in the context of Christ's nature and the resurrection that we see the beauty behind the initial violence. And so we should just be careful about looking at things from a surface level to saying, oh, that contains violence, that contains sexuality, that contains whatever, gore, and so therefore it's automatically wrong. Clearly, we can't apply that in the terms of Christ. And I would say looking through the lens that way, in terms of we can see that display, that ugliness of Christ with that hidden sovereignty and hidden salvation behind it, we can also apply that to any kind of genre, any kind of media that we take in, any kind of story that we tell. horror genre not nonetheless included to that. So we see this, I think, as a celebration, not of death, although we do praise Christ's death for what it brought, but of a celebration of life, that Christ did not just die purely as a martyr, but Christ was risen again and defeated death. I think Paul really puts it eloquently in 1 Corinthians, where he says, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? Not just saying, oh, yeah, guys, that's great, we get to live forever, but almost rubbing it in the face of death and Satan. If you've ever seen the movie Passion of the Christ, Cameron, you might recall that at the end, when Jesus dies, there's that long shot where you have Satan and it zooms out really quickly, and he's basically screaming in anger, right? Like, and the idea of that, oh, he's just been defeated in that way when Christ took his last breath on the cross, because all of the sin of humanity was taken on him. So taking that concept into play, I think that Christians ought to celebrate not just life, but also the destruction of death, and the idea that death has no more of a hold. And just like we would use the image of the cross, the image of Christ bloodied on a cross, covered in gore and so forth, to display that, so often we can do that with destruction and death, which is no longer in power. So to give you an idea of what this would look like, I think we see a theme throughout the Bible, but especially in the Passion narrative, of masquerade, of dressing up in costumes, often as mockery. Of course, you remember Jesus is given a purple robe, given a crown of thorns, has a sign that says, King of the Jews above him, is called the king and asked to prophesy. And no one who has any context of what's going on would say, oh, it's great that they're recognizing Christ as a king in this way. They would say, no, if they're insulting him, they're taking this and they're perverting it to where they're demeaning him of a power. They're taking him as a king and beating him with it, using it ironically in a really savage sense. And so if one can do that with good, and one can pervert good to say we can take the goodness of Christ being a king and mock that and spit on him and do so forth, then why ought Christians not mirror that in the reversements of that? Why can't we take mockery to do it in a different way? You'll even see this on the other side, right? In the present day, you'll have people like organizations like the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple, who are really just edgy atheists, let's be honest, with Spirit Halloween costumes, coming there, and they're usually dressed in kind of mock clergy garb, right? So you'll have pictures there where the one on the right is Marilyn Manson, the rock star, but dressed as the Pope. But you'll have them dressed in these priestly robes, and you have the picture on the left is if you've ever heard the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, they're an LGBT group of men who are drag queens, but they dress as nuns, right? Kind of as a purveyor of that, as an antithesis to that. And so you have this idea of them wearing, and again, no one would look at this and say, well, it's really great that these non-Christians are wearing clergy outfits, that they are doing this and that they're really coming around to it. No, of course, it's meant to be insulting. It's meant to be a mockery of it. It's meant to be a reversal of that expectation. And so in the same way, I think that Christians can take this concept, and in fact have been taking this concept, and run with it the other way. Why not do this with evil and the devil and demons? Why not mock the idea of death not having any power? If one can pervert the good, can one not Christianize the perverse in that way? And you even see Jesus giving essentially authority of this in Luke 10, where he says that I've given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions over the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, don't rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. So yes, there are limitations to this. We shouldn't go overboard with it. But if we're going to have a holiday where people dress up in horror-themed macabre and masquerade in that way, why not see this as a exemplary win for Christianity in a way where we're mocking death, or instead of people being scared of death, we have kids dressed up going around getting candy. And certainly if it was the other way around, certainly if we had 5-year-olds who were dressed up in a crown of thorns and sprung on a makeshift cross, we would probably be insulted by that. That wouldn't be flattering for most people, right? We'd be offended by that. And so if that can be offensive in that way, aren't we not to reciprocate that? So that's kind of
so let me give you let me give you some pushback. So I think sort of central to this idea is that it's okay to dress up and mock some other group. Okay. Because what you're saying in the bottom line here, if opponents of Christianity dress as clergy as a perversion of the church, ought Christians dress as icons of evil in order to Christianize what Christ has already overcome? So this is like a conditional statement. If this group does this, then shouldn't Christians engage in this sort of same behavior? But I think what's sort of the underlying assumption is that it's okay for these opponents of Christianity to dress up in these sort of perverse ways or whatever. or in these mocking ways. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
Because if it's not okay for them to do that, then maybe it's not okay for Christians to do that. Do you see what I'm saying? So like the assumption seems to
Yeah,
be it's got to be okay for them in order for it to be okay for us. But if it's not okay for them, then maybe it's not okay for us. And so it doesn't necessarily follow. What are your thoughts on that?
sure. Yeah, I mean that's a fair point. And I love how you're throwing your syllogisms and propositional logic. Right, we're gonna follow with the therefores, which I appreciate in that way. So I don't think that the issue is that people are dressing up in terms of. I don't think it's wrong. Like I don't think I'm obviously not condoning people who are edgy atheists or Satanists or whatever to mock clergy, but that's not because I'm against the concept of mocking in general. It's because I think what they're mocking is something that's virtuous that shouldn't be mocked. Right? I think that Christ is beautiful and the message behind the gospel that you have, if you have value in the church and the virtues with that, you ought not mock something that's sacred, right? And so we have the presupposition with other arguments in our worldview that these things are sacred and that they should not be mocked. But I don't think it follows that therefore like we ought not mock anything ever. I think that if we are to say, well, no, evil is not virtuous, evil is something that has been defeated, and that we see Christians taking quite a lot of pride in doing this for. I
I
think
see.
that is where we're taking it. You're right. And so, and again, I'm not like saying that this is a new idea, like we should start taking this on. We are already working within the framework of, look, we already have a holiday where people dress up in these kinds of horror demon themed ideas, right? And so I'm just saying, if we already live in that environment, why not have this concept be the driving force behind that? I'm not saying we have to reinvent the wheel with this. So that is a valid point that
Yeah.
you bring up, but I don't think it's
Yeah.
necessary.
Okay. Yeah. So I think what you're saying is that it's basically okay to mock what is evil,
Yes.
right? And so yeah, and so death is evil. That's the basic argument. So it's okay to mock death,
Yes. And you
especially
wouldn't
because
say that.
Christ has conquered death. And I was
Right.
going to apply that back to Marilyn Manson. He thinks I assume he thinks that organized religion is evil, and so on his view, that's why it's okay to
Mhm.
mock religion. So in other words, the underlying general principle, the moral principle here, is basically agreed upon by both parties. It's agreed upon by Marilyn Manson. It's agreed upon by
Right.
Christians. That the underlying principle, just to reiterate, is that it's okay to mock what is evil. Okay,
Yeah.
so what
Yes.
that means though is that it's important what is actually evil. It's
Right.
important what is actually virtuous, because if you are, like you said, we think as Christians that he is mocking something that is virtuous, and that's bad.
Right.
But he nevertheless agrees with the underlying principle that I just explained. But the difference between the two camps is that they disagree on what is evil and what is virtuous. They don't disagree on the moral principle. That's shared by both of them. And so I think that was a good response, because it sort of does away with the objection that if it's okay for him, then it's okay for us. What you're saying is it's not okay for him, but it's okay for us because we have this underlying general principle, this moral principle that
Right.
makes it
Yeah.
sort of makes sense that it's okay to mock. Okay, so here's another question. This one's not necessarily an objection, but I can sense it coming from the comment section already. Okay, and here's what they're gonna say is that Christians don't do that. When you do Halloween and you dress up in these costumes and stuff, and you go out and you collect candy, like no one, like I've never had the idea when I go out and do Halloween that I'm mocking death or that I'm mocking evil. Like I've never thought that or done that. Maybe I need to change. Maybe that's what I actually need to focus on. But I think that in principle, not in principle, like practical terms, I think very few Christians actually do that. So maybe this is like, okay, theoretically that's a good point, but in practice, like most Christians aren't doing that. They just go and they just do whatever they want, basically. So this is not like going to be a justification for people that are already practicing and don't have this. So
Sure.
they might still be, in a difficult situation if they haven't watched this live stream.
Yeah, all the more reason for them to, right? Yeah, certainly that's true. I mean, look, the realistic reason people celebrate Halloween, it's neither because they're Christianizing it to defeat death, nor is it because they're trying to worship the devil and practice the occult. It's because they want to have fun and dress up in candy and have community, and that's
Dress up in
seasonal.
candy.
Yeah, right. Dressing up in candy, right? Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's the main reason. And so,
Some
I'm
people, I guess,
granting
do
that
dress up
that's
in candy.
you dress up and get candy. Yes. So certainly that is a reason, but of course that also parallels that also goes both ways, right? Where you can't say, well, most Christians who dress up in these things aren't intentionally trying to provoke the devil or something, right? Usually the argument
Right.
is, well, maybe you're unintentionally doing this and you're kind of doing this, and it's not wise of you to do this for that reason, if even that's not your
Right.
intent. So there is an underlying premise that although intent matters, it's still there. It can still, you can still be partially responsible, culpable, even without direct intent, right? So it does go both ways. I concede that, but yeah, I'm not. This is not like a mandatory, like all Christians ought to do this. I think that one can have good reason to do that. But just as I don't think a Christian is necessarily wrong to not celebrate, Christmas or something, at least not in the holiday form. I think we should always be grateful for Christ's birth, but to not have to participate in the organized holiday commercial version of it, I
Hmm.
think is up to your own decision. So yes, if a Christian decides not to dress up and as whatever and get candy, that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying
Well,
that it's wrong not to do this, right?
here's a way, maybe, to actually extend your argument, because you were basically making the point that it's okay to mock death.
Right.
What about mocking fear? Like, could that be a way of extending? Because, like, when I think of mocking death, that seems very specific. Like, that's not
Mhm.
going to make it morally permissible to do, like, jack-o'-lanterns, right? Or,
Right.
like, that's not making a jack-o'-lantern, doesn't really seem like you're mocking death.
Sure.
But jack-o'-lanterns are supposed to be scary, right? So maybe you could be mocking fear in that case, which is another thing that Christ has overcome,
Mhm.
is fear. So maybe that's another way to.
Yeah,
Uh,
I actually have a
what was
slide
the term
on
you used? Christoform? What was it?
cruciform.
Cruciform.
Yeah, like a crucifix, but Christocentric is good too. No, I actually have a slide on fear, so it's kind of funny that you bring that up because I was going to get into that a little bit as well. It was like
Yeah.
two
Well, let's
slides.
go. Yeah. Yeah. Let's go ahead
Yeah,
and move on.
yeah. So the next one was similar, just what I was saying about dressing as the devil. So this is a quote here. I won't read it all for time's sake, but from Justin Sean Coyle, who's a associate professor of theology, who basically makes the argument that, like, oh yeah, why not dress as the devil and a form of mockery? So that essentially goes to what we were just saying. So
Hmm.
hold on, I had the
Hmm.
wrong tab open. So yeah, this kind of goes with the idea of fear. So we have Christianization, sorry, replacing perversion with Christianization. So I think when we look at evil, it's not always something that's, or at least I don't know your view of evil, Cameron, in terms of, do you take like a deprivation view, or do you think that evil has ontology in that way?
I am completely agnostic on that
Okay.
question. I know that a lot of very smart people have argued for the privation view.
Mhm.
So I think there's probably something to it. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah, I lean towards the privation view as well, although I admit I have not read that much on it. But the point is I think evil is often not just something that's inherently wrong, but it's a perversion of the good, right? I would say that most ethics comes down to some general principle that humans, or at least persons, I should say, that are certainly of a certain cognizance, have inherent value that ought to be respected, which is why you don't harm people. Generally, you ought to love people, you ought to cooperate, because we have value. And if you're a Christian, because we're made in God's image, but persons in general have this value that ought to be preserved. And so evil actions like murder or stealing or rape or whatever are inherently wrong because they're basically violations of that teleology. They're violations of that value, where you're doing the
Hmm.
opposite of what you ought to do with that. It's disrespecting that. So that's perversion, taking something that's good and making it something to evil. And I think what we do with fear, as you sort of implied it in the comment before we got to this slide, is that we're taking it, when we're making fear into entertainment, you're almost doing the opposite. You're taking something that is inherently generally bad. I mean, we have fear to protect us from things from an evolutionary standpoint, right? But fear generally is not virtuous. It's better to be courageous, and it can cause anxiety and so forth. But we're taking that and we're making it to something that's enjoyable and fun, and removing the harmful element to it, essentially. So I've always thought that, although it's not often thought of, that horror is one of the more intellectual, or at least most interesting genres. And a lot of people think it's just cheap, fast food entertainment. But it's really interesting to think of the paradox between why would humans be drawn to something that they ought to be repulsed by? Why is it that people enjoy being scared when biologically we want to be away from things that scare us, right? Why are we drawn to it? And I think it's the same reason why we have thrill seekers, and the same reason why we have adrenaline junkies, people who ride roller coasters like I do. It's because we like to get that dopamine rush. We like to get that enjoyment, but remove the harm that comes with it. So yes, of course, no one enjoys watching someone actually get murdered, right? But when you're watching actors on a screen portray this, fictionalizing it, you're able to get that rush and that dopamine rush you get because you're seeing something that ought to make you scared. And yet you're in the safety of your own movie theater or home, right? Where there's no actual harm being done.
Well, and
there's
you
no
also,
person
yes,
harmed.
I was just gonna make that point, is that with these movies, especially like, action movies where guys' arms get blown off and stuff, it's all special effects or CGI. It's not like these guys aren't getting. Anyways, continue.
Yeah. As you said, and it's certainly not exclusive to horror, but horror is probably the most example of it. And I have a paper cited down there about the physiological reasons, but when they look at it, typically men have a tendency to enjoy it more. That then has to do with empathy and stuff like that. But I do think it is interesting that there does seem to be a double standard. I would say that's not usually talked about in terms of entertainment and violence, because I look at something and I can see why people would be on the surface offended by a movie where someone's just getting stabbed in the face multiple times, even though, of course, it's fictitious. And yet people are okay with cheering on, for example, football teams where they're literally potentially causing permanent brain damage onto other people.
Yeah, dude.
And
okay.
So
on that note, my wife, like, she can't watch anything with like anything slightly gory.
Sure.
Obviously fictionalized, gore. She just like she can't watch it. But then she'll go around and watch have you seen that show 48 Hours?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't watched it, but
okay. So for anyone who's not familiar with 48 Hours, it's basically like a documentary about actual murder cases, people that die, and then they said the first 48 hours, what they like it's like the opening of the show. It's like the first 48 hours is like the most important in order to catch the criminal. And so they basically document that first 48 hours and try to help you or tell the story of like how this person is caught. But typically with these shows, I mean, that we're dealing with real murder cases. They'll go into detail about like what type of weapon was used, how they died, in the autopsy and stuff, and exactly the way that it's just like there's way more gore and details in that. That to me is like worse in a lot of ways than fake. But she'll watch that like and just go to sleep and no problem. But if she watches watches something that's like obviously fake and like bad fake, she'll have nightmares about it. It's just interesting.
Right. And that's true. And even we also like even react, like you'll wince, like if someone gets their arm broken in a movie and if it's special effects, you'll still like cringe at that, and it still makes you, because you can like empathize with what that would feel like, right? And even though you don't actually feel it. But that's a great point, and I do think that actually is a good gray area where I would probably not encourage people to do so. I do think something like I don't know if you probably didn't watch it, but if you remember the Dahmer documentary that came out on Netflix, or not a documentary, docu-series, like several months back or a year ago or so, very, very popular on Netflix.
It popped up, but I never watched it.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. But like a lot of people were saying that was controversial because, these are reenactments of the deaths of real people. And this was in the 80s. So a lot of their family members are still alive. And so watching people kind of recreate deaths, it's not like the same way where people are enjoying a slasher movie, because you're watching people who actually died these deaths and actual villains, right? So I think that is actually a great area that I would not recommend horror because of that exact reason, because you've gotten rid of the removal aspect, and that's one of the key features, right? It's not good to watch to reminisce about actual violence. Now, studying it for true crime purposes for scholarship, I think, is one thing, but that's different than just, I think, doing it for purely entertainment value. So that is certainly a grip. But yes, but anyway, going back to what we were saying, though, I think it is taking away the power of death. Oh, death, where is your sting? To basically have people no longer, we're watching people pretend and pretend to die when they're not actually, and people are paying money to see it, and it's entertaining in that way. rather than
That is
action
a
harm.
good point. Okay, what you were talking when you laid out this argument earlier, I was thinking, it almost makes me think that the Christians that have a problem with Halloween on the grounds that it, like, quote unquote glorifies fear,
Right.
glorifies death or whatever. And it's like, well, what's wrong with that? Why is that bad? And then the thought might be, well, because that's what Satan loves, or that's what I don't it's almost like we're giving too much power to darkness when, like you said, it's like what did Christ do on the cross? And
Right.
so it's almost, yeah, it's almost like it's I mean, the more you're laying out this case, I think there's something to it. So
I appreciate that. Yeah. And like last thing I'll say is for people who think that it's a glorification, I think the best analogy I can think of, and it's a rather crude one, but it's probably accurate, is I think that horror as a genre, as entertainment, is almost the antithesis of something like pornography, right? Because why is pornography wrong? You're taking something that is good initially, love and intimacy, and you're making it to where it's such a dopamine rush to where you're taking out any like level of virtue and good and making it purely just filled with lust, right? And so you're basically taking what's good about love and completely stripping it down and cheapening it. And that is what you're filling your mind with about that's what love is. I think we're doing the exact same thing, but on the other side with death and horror and violence, right? Where you're taking something that on its surface is terrible and we should always be tragic about, but you're stripping it down to a level where it's purely entertainment and purely fiction and purely actors, and getting a rush out of it and getting enjoyment out of it. And you're no longer scared of it. It doesn't have those effects on you. So to me, it seems like if you're going to condemn one, it doesn't make sense to condemn both of them in terms of if you think that one of them is an actual good, as we said earlier, if you think love is an actual good and you think that violence and death are actual bad things. So if you're going to say
yeah.
that cheapens love, then wouldn't this cheapen violence in that way? So that's where I was going with that. So moving on to the next, did you have anything else to say before we moved on to the next part?
Nope.
Okay, great. So horror and the Christian ethic. So this kind of gets into the concepts of Christian themes in the horror genre, which again seems counterintuitive at first, but you'd be surprised. This is a quote I have about from a paper talking about how the horror genre, at least in the modern day, is almost a modern retelling of Grimm's fairy tales, right? And you'll notice in the highlight red, they talked about how it's the reinforcement of traditional Judeo-Christian values, which a lot of people think, how are stories about demons and teenagers getting axed up enforcing Judeo-Christian values? What's interesting when you think about it, because most of these are not endorsements of these actions in terms of, oh yes, you the viewer ought to go and commit these murders or go out and do this. Usually they're tales of warning. Usually there are stories about, hey, people did this, they messed with the wrong thing, and look what happened to them. They died horribly. Sin has consequences, right? And so they're kind of these modern versions of morality tales like you would see in the Grimm's fairy tales in terms of don't go out in the forest tonight, you'll get eaten by a wolf. Don't do this. So you can see this, for example, in movies like The Exorcist, which I know you mentioned, or at least you mentioned the recent sequel, but this applies to really any exorcism movie. But you can look and say, okay, we ought know that we ought not to engage in occult activity or necromancy or mediumship, right? Or else you're potentially inviting negative things in. And there are plenty of well-known horror movies. I have some on there, most notably The Exorcist, where people mess with things and it causes them to get possessed. But you're not watching the movie saying like, oh, this is really cool, I want to go out and do this. It's like, oh shoot, if that's what's going to happen to me, I'm going to stay far away from that stuff as I possibly can. Now, of course, that's a fictionalized version of it. I'm not encouraging people are, always going to get possessed by using a Ouija board or anything. But I think it's a good tale in terms of you wouldn't watch this thinking that this is somehow an endorsement of this behavior, that you ought to go do this. It's usually people ending quite badly in this. I mean, if you've seen The Exorcist, and I guess I can spoil it, she plays with the original Exorcist, I should say. She plays with a Ouija board, gets possessed by what they think is the devil, and a priest ends up having to sacrifice himself to save her, which is very virtuous. But yes, no one would watch that movie saying, oh yeah, this is clearly an endorsement of the devil. It's clearly a victory for Christ to win. Even at the end of the Conjuring movies, which were written, the screenplay was written by two Christian brothers, by the way. You have the end quote where Ed Warren, who's the main character, I think it's a real quote from him too, where it says, God is real, the devil is real, and and I think it's like beware of the occult or something. I forget how it ends, but that's a generally accurate paraphrase. So yeah, these are not tales of endorsement, but of avoidance. What about non-supernatural ones? What about something like slasher movies, right, where people are getting killed by serial killers and so forth? Well, a lot of these, when you look at the tropes of them, and this is what the paper was referring to with Judeo-Christian values, who are the ones who usually die in these movies? It's not the ones who are virtuous. It's usually the teenagers who are doing drugs, having promiscuous sex, or being just generally stupid or terrible towards people's property or other people. Usually, the stereotype, at least in 80s slasher movies, is that the final girl, the one who survives, is the virgin who's the well-behaved one, essentially, of the group, who's a smart one. And so you're having death being used as a tool to punish other bad behavior. So again, it's not an endorsement of, oh yeah, you ought to do these things. It's saying, well, the people who did these things in the movies got punished for it in that way. And so this is why you have scholars of film kind of attribute this social conservative view of, oh, don't have premarital sex, don't do drugs, or you'll be punished for it in that way. So it's using violence to basically condemn other wrong actions, and violence is the tool in that sense. Now, we're not saying that people who actually do these things deserve to get killed. Let me just put that out there. But again, these are fictionalized, exaggerated, anthropomorphized tales of morality that we see about these kinds of ethics. Other ones, don't be obsessed with the past in that way. Move on. Suffering is real. Theodicy is a real thing that we need to consult. But we ought not get too hampered up in our past and be unable to forgive people, be unable to move on and to see redemption in Christ. And many movies, horror movies, you'll see people get into trouble precisely because they can't let go of the past. They're hanging on to the death of a loved one or some tragedy. And when they go seeking that out, that's when tragedy ends up happening. I particularly recommend this Martyrs over here, by the way, if you haven't seen it. It's a French movie, very, very brutal and graphic, but very interesting in terms of the way it kind of plays into theodicy and the little twist that goes with it. It's really interesting, but it does have some of the Christian themes of martyrdom in that way.
So real quick, Maverick Christian just sent in a super chat. He says, Talk to Me is a really good horror movie that basically says, don't engage in occult practices, even has a Christian character. Have you seen that one or heard about it?
I did. That came out in July, I think. So it's pretty good.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's a possession movie.
To
very
add that.
Creative. But yeah, he's absolutely right. It does have a Christian character, and it's definitely definitely would not make you want to do it. In fact, I'm going to spoil a little bit here, but the first half of the movie is people doing this and they think like this possession stuff is really cool. It actually has a modern version of it where people, which I thought was dumb, but actually is probably the most realistic version, where people have this game where they get possessed for like 90 seconds and everyone has their iPhones out and they're filming it, which probably would happen today if it did happen, right? And so they're like, oh, is this fake or real? But that ends up going bad places. And so it's like, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing these games where you're messing with demons, right? You probably should be avoiding that, like the Christian character suggested. So yeah, I think Maverick's absolutely right to bring that up in that way. And the last one I have on here is treat others well. A lot of horror movies, the people who die, as we said, are really bad people, and some of these are about people who do really bad things. The main character does something bad, or it's around people who need to change, right? So Carrie, you have a girl who's being bullied her entire time, and then she ends up getting revenge towards the end of them. Drag Me to Hell is about a banker who denies a loan to a poor woman, to a widow, and the widow ends up being a witch and curses her, and then stuff happens. Saw, which is one of my favorites, I know I mentioned, I think before we started, right when we started, is actually one of the interesting ones. There's a video essay on YouTube. I forget who it's by. I think it's Wisecrack, but it has well over 1 million views, and it's like the philosophy of Saw. And he actually compares it, the philosophy of Jigsaw, who's the main villain in that movie, he compares it to Kierkegaard and says that that's reflecting a Judeo-Christian ethic, which is really interesting. But the concept of Saw is that you have this cancer patient who's dying, and he basically puts other people who he says aren't appreciating their lives into these traps. And so the concept's like, well, look, I have a timer on my life. I know what it's like to know when I'm going to die, essentially, because I only have a few months to live. And yet so many people waste their lives doing drugs or having affairs and so forth. And so the people who are usually put into these traps, at least originally, are pretty bad people. They're drug addicts, people who he doesn't think values their life. And they're always able to get out of these traps. So it's not going to automatically kill you just for torture purposes, but you have to do something terrible. So it's like, oh, you have a device that's going to kill you. There's a key, but the key's behind your eye. You have to gouge out your own eye. Really gory stuff that's brutal. But usually it's themed with the person's vice and their sin. And so although that's a rather extreme example, you do have this idea of suffering leading to rehabilitation, that he thinks that people will be literally reborn. I think he uses that phrase, they'll be reborn and become virtuous if they survive these, because they'll have a new perspective on life and appreciate their life. Again, not encouraging that actually be played out, but you do have the Christian themes there in that concept. So that's just several of many examples we could give in terms of Christian themes underlying a lot of these. And one of my favorite directors, Scott Derrickson, who I think I mentioned to you before, is a Christian, and I have a quote from him here where he talks about how the horror genre does kind of exemplify that and that way. And by the way, he also directed Doctor Strange, if you're a Marvel fan, the first Doctor Strange as well. So he's a pretty notable director. But he's directed The Exorcism of Emily Rose, Sinister, which is one of my personal favorites, and The Black Phone, which came out I think a few years ago, one of his most recent ones. So a lot of really interesting.
Yeah,
concepts.
that is a really interesting quote. I encourage people to just pause the video and just read it.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about horror movies that don't have good messages. Would you still recommend watching them, or would you say avoid those?
Yeah, I think the problem with that is there's a lot of subjectivity to it in terms of what is and isn't a good message, right? Because you can always say, well, even if it's dark. For example, Sinister, which Derrickson directed, has a very tragic. It does not have a happy ending. I'll say I won't spoil what it is, but it's about a father who moves in with his family, and he's writing a true crime book. He had a book that was big back in 2002, and he can't let it go, and he wants to.
Side note: tragedy is like my favorite genre. I don't know why.
Oh, is it? Maybe, but I think tragedy does make us think about theodicy and stuff a lot, because often in the story, in our own lives, we can't see a happy ending, but we know there's one down ultimately, even though you don't always see it, right? But anyway, in the movie, Ethan Hawke's character moves in, and he's trying to recreate this true crime book. Like, he's like, oh, this was my big hit back 2002. I need to find something else. And so they move into this house where people were previously murdered, and he finds all these pieces of evidence for it. And throughout the movie, as he's becoming more obsessed with this, like, oh, this is gonna be the best book ever, his wife is like, just forget this, let's move out of the house, let's do all this stuff and just let it go. And he can't. And so, like, although the movie has a very dark ending and stuff like that, you can see, like, okay, is the theme here to not abandon your family, to prioritize what's important and not become obsessed with fame and these vices, right? So it is very hard to find. I guess because of subjectivity, I don't know if there's an outright movie I would say don't watch. Now, there are ones that I think have good themes, but that the movie themselves have like gratuitous content. So you can have movies where maybe it's presenting a good message if the people who are performing drug abuse or promiscuity are punished for it, right? Maybe that's the Christian ethic. But if the movie shows excessive nudity or so forth, is that a problem? Could be. And so I think that's up to each person's jurisdiction. But I don't want to be in the position of saying you can or can't watch this or participate. So that's going to be up to each person. But it is definitely very subjective. But that is a good question, though, in terms of that. I'm also on the wrong one. So last thing we'll say, and this is the shortest one, I think there's only one slide, is that with all of this being said, I think there are ways in which Christians
go back to the previous slide.
That one.
It says, for those of you that are having trouble reading this, it says horror as a tool for Christianity, not a weapon.
Yes, and I have a picture of hell there. So what I mean by that is that I think fear, although we've said the benefits of using fear as this kind of aesthetic tool about Christianity, we also should avoid using it as a weapon to scare people into Christianity. There's a very fine line between celebrating death being defeated and using death as a concept to try to scare people and make Christianity this very bleak version of just avoid destruction. So one of the most notable examples is a evangelical hell house. So, and this is not just with evangelicals. You can look back in the medieval period and see plenty of churches where there's depictions of hell, and this would be used to scare the peasants into following the church, right, when it had its more corrupt periods before the Reformation. But evangelicals are just as guilty of this as well, if not more egregiously. And I don't know if you've ever seen this before, Cameron, but in the South, especially in more Baptist fundamentalist parts of the U.S., it's not uncommon to have Christian-themed haunted houses called hell houses, or sometimes judgment houses, depending on who's doing it. There's actually companies that will lease these out to churches, and they're basically meant to scare you and to say, instead of having demons and ghosts, we're going to have people be scared of sin. So usually there'll be a scene where people will be doing drugs, and one of them will overdose. You'll have scenes where people are committing suicide, like you have pictured there. The one on the left, it's common to have a scene where someone gets pregnant and tries to have a botched abortion. That's what the image is there, and there's a demon over her, right? And it's like, oh, it went horribly wrong, and people regret it. But it's like, oh, look how scary sin is. Look at all this stuff. And then usually it ends with all these people, the actors in hell, and people walking through it and suffering, right? And being tortured, and like, oh, why did I do all that? And then the last room is usually a room of heaven, and you have Jesus and God, and some other people have a happy ending, right? The characters who were Christians in the play basically have a happy ending. And then they'll end with a room where they ask anyone who wants to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior to do so. So although I can appreciate the thought, I do feel like this is incontrovertibly quite exploitive and quite abusive, especially when they're encouraging, fairly young kids to go into these things and watch them as well, and potentially traumatizing to them. So I'm not saying that we can't talk about sin's consequences in a way that's real. I'm not saying that we can't talk about hell, depending on what version of hell you believe in. But there's a very fine line between doing that in a way where you're presenting the gospel message versus just flat out trying to scare people into making a rash decision last minute of, hey, do you want to avoid all this stuff? Accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and treating it like it's fire insurance, essentially. Not to mention much of the stuff they're depicting is quite graphic and I would say fairly insensitive and perhaps even guilt tripping of people who have been through stuff like that, right? In that way. So I don't think presenting the concept in the way, and not only to mention that it's not even a biblical concept, like, having the portrayal of demons torturing people in hell acts as if hell is Satan's paradise where Satan rules and the demons do all this stuff, when in reality the biblical view is that Satan is punished in hell along with the demons. He's not the king of hell. That comes from Paradise Lost, which is a poem from the Middle Ages, not from the Bible. So I think there's plenty of theological things that are wrong with it, but I think that using these kinds of tactics to just flat out scare and exploit people is a very dangerous thing. And so I wanted to be pretty outspoken that I'm not condoning this, and that I think there's ways Christians should not be celebrating that. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on these, Cameron? Are you familiar with these at all?
No, I'm actually looking through the live chat to see if there's anyone in the live chat that is not a fan of Halloween and wants to give some objections that we haven't really covered in the live stream so far. So unfortunately, I don't have any extra thoughts.
Yeah.
But I did find one comment that we could possibly address.
Sure.
So if you're good with the presentation there, we can move to some Q&A.
Yeah, it was literally just conclusion, which was the points I'd said. I think Halloween and horror themes are not inherently anti-Christian. There's plenty of underlying Christian themes. We should be mocking evil and celebrating the victory of Christ. Plenty of ethics in horror movies, and we have to be careful about how we carry this out. So that's just the summary of what it was. But yeah, if we want to go to questions, we can. So.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we may not go through a whole lot. We're probably going to wrap the stream up pretty soon here. But we did have a question or not really a question, but there's just more of a comment from someone. Looks like Jacob Jones. Halloween is also a satanic holiday. If you look up the Satanic Temple, Halloween is a satanic holiday. Do you have any thoughts or anything on that?
I think he's getting that. There's a quote by Anton LaVey, who's the founder of modern Satanism back in, I think, the 60s. And he's like, oh, I love seeing Christians celebrate Halloween because they dress their kids up and they're worshiping the devil, right? And Michael Jones had a short video responding to this I thought was really well done. But first of all, I don't think that the Church of Satan gets dibs in terms of the real meaning of Halloween because they didn't invent the holiday, right? This predates them by 1,000 years or more. So I don't think because figures come out and say, oh, this is what we mean it to mean, has any validation towards that. Just as I don't think that if a clergy member or a pastor came out and said, oh, pornography is great because we're just showing love to all these people, even though there's obviously wrong implications of that wouldn't be automatically a vindication of that either. So I don't think that it means much at all to say, well, some Satanists have said that it's a holiday to worship Satan. And as we said, even if that were the case, which is already quite incontrovertible, if that were the case, aren't we not to take things that are evil and make them Christian in the first place? Are we not to take that and to make it reborn, where we put Christianization rather than perversion? So even if that were true, I don't think it follows at all. But I don't think that Anton LaVey gets to say anything about what the true meaning of Halloween is, as if they can declare it.
All right. I think this will be the last comment that we'll address, and then we'll close out the stream. So this one's from Juan, and this is a thought that I've had personally as well, is that like when it comes to Halloween, well, let me read his comment. In actuality, we can celebrate Halloween. It's just that we don't have to celebrate the bad parts of Halloween. So supposing that there are bad parts of Halloween, I mean, I've thought the same thing. Like, you don't have to, the way that we celebrate Halloween is the kids dress up in a costume and we go around and get candy from neighbors, and it's like a fun time. We're not like sitting here thinking that, oh, we're going to invite some evil spirits into the house right now and say these, incantations, and like none of that is remotely close to
Right.
on our minds. However, I did think of a potential counterexample. Okay, um, so again, just to kind of reiterate the point of this is that when it comes to Halloween, you don't have to celebrate like what you think are the bad parts of that holiday. Okay, so but here's a potential counterexample for the vast majority of Christians. So Pride Month is what, June? So you
Yeah.
could maybe say like going to a pride parade, Christians can still go to that. They just don't want to, they just wouldn't be celebrating the bad parts. But that seems like a counterexample. Like you would nevertheless seem like it's still nevertheless a bad idea for Christians to celebrate Pride Month. So maybe that's a
Yeah.
counterexample to that. I mean, I have a response to that, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's definitely different because it's a much more recent idea that was developed with like that in mind in terms of that being the intention. And not to mention pride is itself a sin. So I feel like having like Christians, anything that would even be called pride, I feel like would be problematic. I mean, I guess you could say you're proud to be a Christian, but that's not the same thing as is meaning that. But you will see some really diehard social conservatives who, or at least on their social media pages, where they'll have like straight pride or something, right? They want to try to have like a counter movement, and I don't think that's the way to go about it. But I don't think that's really
Yeah, there
analogous
was.
to the reasons we've said. But for the themes that I don't think the same themes that we've expressed are really going to be found in there. Now you can have pride for love of another person and of community. I think that's great, and that's Valentine's Day is for romantic love, right? But it's just the particular aspects of the sexuality that Christians would have issue with. And so, yeah, I think it would be much harder as a Christian to celebrate, say, oh, I'm celebrating Pride, but I'm not celebrating in this way, right? Because most people who go to a Pride parade go to it in order to celebrate that. It's not as if it's not the same thing where you have kids who go just to get candy and the parents are not thinking about, oh, my kid might potentially worship Satan or something inadvertently. But people who go to a pride parade 99% of the time are going there deliberately to celebrate, LGBT issues and this kind of showing off of the sexuality. Whereas that's not the intention of most Christians who are celebrating Halloween is to worship the devil. So I think there's, for many of those reasons, I don't know if those are parallel examples.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, who attempted and failed at starting a new movement in the Christian community. This was back before like social media was really a big thing. Anyways, he wanted to start. I'm trying to think of the exact way that he phrased it. Take back, like hashtag take back the rainbow, something like that. So like, because the rainbow obviously is a very important symbol in the Old Testament with Noah and stuff. And so that was maybe one way that you could still celebrate Pride Month as a Christian. Take back the rainbow. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know who else did that was Ken Ham. At least I don't know if that's who you're talking about, but they have a whole thing.
Oh
They
no,
do
I did not
because
know that.
it's in
Was
Genesis
that
with
how
Noah's
recent
Ark.
was that?
Oh no, they have. You can literally buy shirts, and where I was born is like probably an hour and a half, 2 hours from the Creation Museum. So like I'm familiar with them, but you can buy shirts that say "Take Back the Rainbow" at,
Oh my
at their
gosh.
gift shop. I'm not even kidding. So it's a big thing there. Like they'll light it up in rainbows because like, oh, the rainbow was given to Noah by God, and that's what it means.
Right.
But yeah, so yeah, it's interesting that you say that because it's kind of a theme I've seen as well. But
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, no, this was a great stream though. I really appreciate you putting that together. I think your argument was solid. Like I think it's a really good reason to like mocking evil is that's good.
I appreciate that, Cameron. And yeah, like I said, I know this was relatively a last minute thing, but I'm glad we could do something a little bit different on the channel. But it's great to just throw out ideas and gives people, I think, an interesting resource. And even if they don't agree with me, which I expect many people not to, at least give the other side of the argument, give the devil's advocate, right? And to give them something to think about, to at least say, well, even if I don't agree with you, I can at least understand where you're coming from. I can at least understand that
Yeah.
this isn't incompatible. And if you still convicted, I absolutely respect that. I'm not saying that you ought to do this or that this is an obligation. I'm just saying in defense of those who want to celebrate the parts of Halloween that are more expressive of, the gore and violence or whatever. don't take that as don't take that as a celebration of those things any more than you would take the celebration, the depiction of Christ bloodied on a cross, the celebration of death of Christ, or the death of an innocent man, right? Context is what's important, and that's what we're trying to establish here.
Super good. Yeah. Yeah, I also like the bit about horror movies and how the message, you know, is usually actually positive, even though that there's like horrible elements. But that's, you know, the same is exactly true for the Bible. I mean, like, what did Jesus go through? It details it in the Gospels, you know, and that's horrible, but it detailed it. And I mean, would you? Well, maybe this is an interesting question. Would you label The Passion as a horror movie?
No, although it certainly is. It earns its R rating for the gore, right? And some people criticized Mel Gibson for that, but no, I wouldn't say that it's a horror movie in that sense, but it is.
Well, I mean, they do have like scenes of the devil and stuff, you know, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I was surprised rewatching that, because it was one of those where I had seen it like when I was young and had forgotten a lot about it. And I remember rewatching it like a few years ago, and I was like, I don't remember there being scenes where demon kids chase Judas and have him hang himself, or you know, it's like quite like creepily done too. It's not like it just. And there was, I think, one scene where, if I remember, Jesus is being flogged, and you have Satan in the background, and he has this baby, and it's like this deformed, really creepy looking one. And I had always thought of that as him basically mocking the virgin birth, because in the scene he kind of looks like he's wearing a black robe, but he looks almost like a mirror version of the depictions of the Virgin Mary. And it almost looked like it was like, oh, is this how, look how I'm treating my kid? Is that how, where's your dad at right now? Basically, like, as he's getting beaten. So you know, in the exact same way where Satan is mocking Christ by, you know, inverting the virgin birth, it's kind of what we're trying to do, the opposite of that. So it is interesting. But yeah, I rewatching that, I was like, this is a lot creepier and darker than I thought. So you might very well be right, but what categorizes something as a horror film is always a little subjective. But I could easily see someone being traumatized by watching Passion of the Christ, and it is a very hard watch. I still still flinch at it.
Yeah. Oh, one last thing before we close out is I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, so I don't really have my own channel right now, at least not at the moment, but you can buy, I have 2 books on Amazon right now. One's on the resurrection, and I will have those linked in the description, called Undead. And the other one is on theodicy, called Searching for a Solution to Suffering. And I'm currently working on a 2-volume work, at least 2 volumes at the moment, book on miracles, which will probably be out sometime next year. At least one of the volumes will be. So be on the lookout for that. I have a paper on academy.edu about one of the miracle cases. We can also link that. And I'm also on the channel. I kind of channel hop. So I've been on Cameron's channel, obviously, Braxton Hunter's channel. And I've been on my friend Than Christophilus, who I know Cameron has played Smash Bros with before. His channel many of times since we go back and forth on that. So yeah, check me out on any of those platforms. And again, thank you so much for hosting this, Cameron, and I looked forward to this and really appreciated it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?